The Arctic, a harsh and unique land, has not escaped human harm. The Kara Sea, the edge of the Arctic Ocean, once the cleanest body of water on the planet, today is essentially a huge dump for radioactive waste, which the Soviet Union dumped here for decades. Compared to this nuclear dump, the much talked about release of radioactive water from Fukushima is nothing. Today, thousands of containers with dangerous nuclear waste and dozens of sunken ships from the Soviet atomic fleet lie at the bottom of the Kara and Barents Seas. All this stuff not only poisons the ocean, but also poses the risk of a nuclear explosion. But even if the worst never happens, a severe environmental disaster in the region is just a matter of time. So in this video, we'll talk about when and why the Arctic turned into a nuclear dump, what's currently lying on the seabed, which objects pose the greatest danger, and how this problem can be solved. My name is Semyon, this is the NGS television channel. Let's begin. A submarine graveyard. In 2014, experts from the Institute for Safe Development of Nuclear Energy at the Russian Academy of Sciences noted that the Soviet Union and Russia account for half of all radioactive waste ever dumped in the world's oceans. Moreover, the overwhelming majority of it, more than 90%, ended up in the Kara Sea. There is an explanation for why there is so much and why the Arctic suffered the most. The nuclear submarine was the backbone of Soviet strategic forces, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had more submarines than all other countries combined. The Soviet Union launched its first nuclear submarine in 1958, and by the mid-1990s, more than 240 had been built. For decades, they served on combat duty worldwide, awaiting the moment the Cold War might turn hot. Fortunately, that never happened. Most Soviet nuclear submarines were part of the Northern Fleet and were based on the Kola Peninsula. All the infrastructure for servicing their nuclear power plants was also located here, including the storage facility for radioactive materials. A nuclear submarine lasts only 20 to 30 years before becoming morally and physically obsolete. But getting rid of such a vessel is a different story. It is necessary to remove the nuclear fuel from the reactor core, load it into special containers, and send them to a long-term storage facility. There's even more hassle with the reactor itself, which also needs to be removed and sealed. I would add that all of this is complex and dangerous work that requires the highest level of expertise. For example, in 1985, during the unloading of spent fuel from under the submarine, there was an explosion that killed 10 workers. More people were exposed to dangerous radiation, and radioactive materials were released into the air and sea, so Soviet admirals preferred not to bother and simply dumped all sorts of radioactive waste into the sea. And since the largest submarine fleet was in the Soviet Union in the north, the Arctic suffered the most. It is believed that about 32,000 cubic meters of solid radioactive waste were buried in Arctic waters overall, according to the organization Bellona, which has been dealing with Arctic environmental issues for several decades. During the Soviet era, the Northern Fleet dumped 17,000 containers of nuclear materials, 19 ships with radioactive waste, and 735 pieces of contaminated equipment. The main problem is not knowing exactly where most of these dangerous objects are. They dumped not only nuclear materials, but also entire reactors or their separate components, and even more liquid radioactive waste ended up in the sea. Environmentalists believe that from 1965 to 1995, about 320,000 cubic meters of such waste were dumped into Arctic waters, an enormous scale. There are now 7 official radioactive zones in the Kyrgyz Sea, mainly near Novaya Zemlya, at depths of 12 to 380 meters. Here, 7 reactors with spent nuclear fuel have been sunk, along with 9 more containing various components but without fuel. Scientists are particularly concerned about the submarine B-159, which lies at a depth of 170 meters at the entrance to the Kola Bay. It was launched back in 1963 and sank in 2003 while being towed to the Nerpa shipyard for disposal. 9 people died in the incident. But the worst part is that the submarine's reactors were not prepared for flooding because it happened suddenly and as an emergency. There haven't been any radiation leaks so far, but in this case, it's only a matter of time. Additionally, the submarine is in a busy shipping area. Putin is hiding this as much as he can. Even greater concern is caused by another Soviet submarine, K-27. It was an experimental submarine with a liquid metal coolant, commissioned in early 1962. The vessel was very unsuccessful, plagued by constant breakdowns and many radiation accidents. The sailors nicknamed it Nagasaki. In 1981, the K-27 was towed to the Kara Sea and sunk with its reactors and nuclear fuel. And they did this at a depth of only 50 meters, even though experts believe that a relatively safe depth for burying radioactive waste is 3,000 meters. Scientists fear that if water suddenly gets into the K-27 reactors, a chain reaction could start there, and then there would be a big explosion in the Kara Sea. Both Russian and foreign experts consider the K-27 the most dangerous of the objects sunk in the Arctic. There's also the submarine Komsomolets, which sank to the bottom of the Norwegian Sea in 1989, along with its loaded reactors and nuclear torpedoes on board. A 2019 deep-sea vehicle inspection of the submarine found increased radiation levels near its hull. Attention, 100,000 times more. However, Komsomolets lies at a depth of 1.5 kilometers, so it poses less danger than K-27 or B-159. Civilian Soviet sailors also contributed to the pollution of the Arctic. You've probably heard about the nuclear icebreaker Lenin, the pride of the Soviet Arctic fleet. Its reactors also lie at the bottom of the Kara Sea. Nuclear testing site. Another source of radioactive contamination in the Arctic was the testing of Soviet nuclear weapons on Novaya Zemlya. Here, from 1955 to the 1990s, 132 nuclear tests were conducted. In October 1961, the so-called Tsar Bomba, a 58-megaton thermonuclear device, was detonated on Novaya Zemlya. All nuclear weapons tests, underwater, surface, air, and underground, were conducted at the test site. Nuclear explosions led to radioactive contamination of the air, the island's coastlines, seawater, and seabed sediments. The underwater nuclear tests conducted here from 1955 to 1961 had especially severe consequences for marine ecosystems. Nuclear, surface, and atmospheric explosions took place at the test site until 1962, after which only underground tests were conducted in the archipelago. And although they are considered the safest, they also contributed to environmental pollution. For example, the last underground explosion in 1990 led to the fracturing of rock formations. Radioactive gases released into the atmosphere were detected in all Scandinavian countries. Currently, the most complicated situation in terms of radioactive contamination is observed in Chernaya Bay on the southern island of the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, where underwater nuclear weapons tests were conducted. Here, a significant excess of plutonium and cesium isotope concentrations has been found in the bottom sediments. Nuclear weapons tests harmed not just nature. Residents of the Soviet Arctic also felt their effects directly. From 1971 to 1991 in the Izhma district of Komi, official statistics show cancer cases rose 5-fold and skin diseases 13-fold. Recently, Putin has repeatedly promised to resume nuclear weapons testing on Novaya Zemlya, understandably worrying residents of Russia's northern regions. However, it's unlikely anyone will ask their opinion. Radioactive leaks from storage facilities, leaks of radioactive materials from storage sites and military bases are another source of radioactive contamination in the Arctic. In 1983, a large emergency storage facility for spent nuclear fuel was built at Andreeva Bay, located on the Murmansk coast of the Barents Sea. By the late 1980s, there were more than 22,000 spent fuel assemblies stored there, unloaded from 100 nuclear reactors, submarines, and nuclear icebreakers. Continued. In addition, at Andreeva Bay, 18,600 cubic meters of solid radioactive waste were simply stored in the open air. The total activity of the entire nuclear waste site was estimated by experts at 3.6 million curies, which is simply an enormous figure. In some areas, gamma radiation levels here were 1,000 to 10,000 times above the safe limit. The reason for this is simple. The base was equipped in absolutely unsatisfactory conditions. For example, the walls of many storage facilities had rusted so badly that rain would wash nuclear waste directly into the sea. As a result, 600,000 tons of water with a high concentration of radionuclides ended up in the Barents Sea, just 60 kilometers from the Norwegian border. At the end of the 1990s, the military handed over the facilities at Andriva Bay to Rosatom, after which supposedly large-scale efforts to clean up this radioactive dump began. And they did this using money from other countries. But as always, it's easier to destroy than to build. They planned to finish the work at Andriva Bay by 2028, but after Putin's aggression against Ukraine began, Western money and technology left Russia, and now the issue is up in the air because of sanctions. However, despite some progress at this site, dozens of kilograms of radioactive waste that entered the environment back in the Soviet period are not going anywhere and will poison nature for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And Andriva Bay is far from the only site that poses a radiation hazard. There are also atom float bases where old Soviet icebreakers are stored, along with their own spent fuel storage facilities and other hazardous sites. The elimination of this part of the Soviet nuclear legacy also requires a lot of time and huge investments. What's next? To be continued. The Arctic is becoming increasingly important. Deep within the region and on northern sea shelves, vast reserves of oil, natural gas, gold, diamonds, nickel, tungsten, uranium, molybdenum, and palladium are hidden. For example, two large hydrocarbon fields, Rusanovskoye and Leningradskoye, were found in the Kara Sea. How can you drill for oil here if the seabed is covered in radioactive junk? The Arctic contains 1/5 of the world's total freshwater reserves. We shouldn't forget about the biological resources of these seas, which are also very important for a growing humanity. But hardly anyone would want to eat fish that makes the dosimeter go off the scale. And the warming of the planet's climate is turning the northern sea route into a very promising route for global trade. But again, who would want to sail through a radioactive dump? Nuclear pollution in the Arctic still remains a major unresolved problem. The problem is so complex and large-scale that there simply isn't a simple or quick solution for it. In this sense, the great and mighty Soviet Union left a real headache for several subsequent generations, not only for Russians, but also for other nations living in the Arctic region. You can only sympathize with the Canadians or Scandinavians. They were really unlucky with their neighbors. I've already said that over the past 20 years, steps have been taken to clean up the Arctic from the Soviet nuclear legacy. However, achieving any results was largely possible thanks to generous international assistance and Western technologies. Today, in the context of war and sanctions, European grants will have to be forgotten. In 2021, while chairing the Arctic Council, Russia unveiled an ambitious plan. Over the next 14 years, the Russians plan to raise a large number of radiation-hazardous objects sunk during the Soviet era from the bottom of the Arctic, including 2 nuclear submarines. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development promised funding for this program, but the war changed everything. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the submarines at the bottom of the cold seas were forgotten. Nothing changed over the next 3 years. The situation remained on hold. Modern Russia has neither the resources nor the technology to clean up the Arctic, let alone the Kara Sea. Right now, it's much more important for the Russian leadership to turn yet another Ukrainian city in Donbas into rubble. There are plans being voiced by Russian experts who are working on this issue. They believe that the K-27 and B-159 submarines should be raised first, as they pose the greatest danger. But how can this be done like when they raised the Kursk? Remember what Putin said? It sank. Russia had to hire a special ship from the Dutch because in 20 years of Putin's stability, the Russians never got such ships of their own. Experts believe that the containers holding the ship reactors and waste will last until about the middle of the century, so it's preferable to clean up the Arctic in the next decade. If Russia can't do this, then the international community will have to take on this problem, because nobody wants a new Chernobyl in the Arctic Ocean. Instead of an afterword? When we were preparing this episode, we asked ourselves a very natural question. How can you treat your own country's territory so carelessly? After all, the people who dumped and discharged all sorts of radioactive waste into their own seas knew perfectly well what they were doing and how dangerous the consequences would be. Maybe it's a trait of the Russian mentality to turn any territory they can reach into a dumping ground. I haven't found any other explanations so far, so write yours in the comments. See you all later.